You will recall that last week we spent our time talking about the ethos, as it were, of the prayer book and the spirituality that is suggested by the prayer book, the way in which the prayer book kind of puts before us at the same time a number of different dimensions of the life of the church and the individual life of faith. That was pretty much the thrust of our discussion last week. Before we jump into today's discussion, do we want to revisit anything that we talked about last week, or anybody come up with any questions or thoughts that occurred to them over the course of the week that they wanted to touch base on, having to do with anything that we talked about last week? Going once? Going twice? Gone. Okay. So you should have a handout in front of you with the title at the top that says Structure of the BCP. All we're really going to do today is basically just try and walk through the whole thing. So there's prayer books on the tables, and you've got the outline in front of you. If you want to open the prayer book to the very front where the table of contents is, it might be helpful to have that immediately available to you, but you're not going to need to do too much flipping back and forth. What I want to focus on is the way in which the prayer book kind of hangs together, the internal logic of the structure of the prayer book, if you will. Because if you get a sense of the internal logic of the structure of it, then it begins to make sense as to where the pieces are and how the pieces fit together. It's not just accidental that things are placed where they are, right? And it's not just accidental that this element is next to this element, is next to this element, and so on. There is an integrity to the structure itself, and once you kind of grasp that structure or the layout or the arrangement or whatever you want to call it, then the prayer book as a whole kind of becomes much more accessible and much more available to you. What I want to do to start is actually draw your attention on the outline almost down to the bottom of the first side of that outline. You'll see a bullet with a header that says the heart of the prayer book. That section right there is in some respects the most quote-unquote important section of the whole prayer book. So many other elements of the prayer book revolve around that section that section is pretty much the thing that gives structure and meaning to everything else. And if you look at the services that are included in that section, you'll see that they all have to do with what? They all have to do with Lent and Holy Week, right? Within the context of that section of the prayer book, there's something even closer to the heart of the prayer book. There's one particular service that in some respects we might say is more important or more central than all the others, and that's the last one that's listed under that section, the Great Vigil of Easter. That's it right there. The Great Vigil of Easter, I suggest to you, is the service that lends structure and organization to the whole prayer book. That service is the one on which every other service in some way, shape, or form depends, liturgically at least. Because what you've got in that service, what you've got in the Great Vigil of Easter, is a little bit of everything, right? You've got a little bit of something like the daily office, you've got baptism, you've got communion, you've got the Christian year, you've got everything kind of laid out in one liturgical package. That service, the Great Vigil, is the center of the church year. It's the most important and significant observance of the Christian calendar. And it's the one that organizes the whole of Holy Week, and it's the one that organizes, in some respects, the rest of the calendar, and thus the rest of the prayer book. So I say all of that to you as a way of suggesting that at the heart of the prayer book, the most important thing, the thing that gives structure and organization to everything else, is the church's witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? What's most important about that, what's most important about this as a document and as a spiritual path and as a way of organizing the worship of the church, is the church's witness to the resurrection of Jesus. That's where we begin. And if you want to talk about the office, if you want to talk about baptism, if you want to talk about communion, I don't care what you want to talk about. You want to talk about the catechism? Great. Everything goes back to the church's witness to Jesus Christ. And not just the church's witness to the resurrection as a historical event, as important as that is, not just the church's witness to the remembrance of something that happened a long, long time ago, but rather the church's witness to the living presence of the risen Christ in and through the church, right? So when the church gathers to worship, when we gather, we baptize people, when we celebrate communion, when we gather for the office, whatever, the thing we are always doing is bearing witness to the presence of Christ in our midst. We're basically saying when we come together as the church and we pick up this document and do whatever it is we do with this document, Jesus is here. God is at work. God is at work in us. God is at work through us. God is at work in the world. And one of the things we're doing is bearing witness to that. We're bearing witness to the fact that the living presence of the risen Christ is here today with us now. You're not going to get any more fundamental than that when it comes to the prayer book, right? That's the thing that pretty much drives everything else. That's the thing that gives meaning to baptism. That's the thing that gives meaning to our celebration of communion. That's the thing that gives meaning to our encounter with God in daily life, in the daily office, everything. So, if you were to ask yourself the question, well, what's the thing that kind of helps make sense of the rest of it? I would say it's that. Liturgically speaking, textually speaking, it's the Great Vigil of Easter. And what is it about the Great Vigil that is especially significant? It's the fact that the Great Vigil, perhaps more so than any other liturgical observance, reminds the church that what we're doing when we gather is we are bearing witness to the presence of the risen Christ. You think about that story in John, right? When Jesus appears to the disciples after he's, after he's been raised. The disciples are doing what? They're scared out of their minds. So they're hiding behind locked doors. Jesus shows up and breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit. Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." He has the encounter with Thomas, right? Thomas recognizes him, my Lord and my God. That story in some ways is representative or illustrative of what we're doing when we pick up the prayer book. We are expecting to encounter the presence of the risen Christ here with us today, not just as a historical reality, but here with us today. So I start this as a way of reminding us that the prayer book is never just about the text. Right? The text is important. The text has something to teach us. The text is the means we use to organize our worship and our spiritual experience. It's great. But the text always refers away from itself to something else. Right? The text refers us to the presence of God living and active in our lives and in the world. Let me pause there and see if you have thoughts or questions or anything you want to talk further about having to do with that issue, having to do with that point. I've either offended everybody or what? Is that new? Is that familiar? Is that kind of like, yeah, okay, we got that, let's move on, or did that sound like something you perhaps hadn't heard before?
Just come to church on Christmas and Easter, they're on the right track.
Our C&E brothers and sisters are close to the kingdom, right? Like Jesus encounters, you are not far from the kingdom, but you're not quite there yet. Come a little closer, right? Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at the structure of it then. Let's talk more about the actual contents of it. And as I said, if at some point here you want to stop and say, wait a minute, let's drill down a bit here. Let's talk about that section. I've got some questions about that issue. We can do that. The first thing you'll get, the very front end of the prayer book, is what appears to be preparatory material, but is actually quite important. Those first few sections on the ratification of the prayer book, the preface of the prayer book, and the services of the church, at the very beginning, before you even get to the calendar, have important things to say about how Episcopalians situate themselves within the broader Catholic tradition of Christianity, right? In other words, those sections of the prayer book intend to make the point that we conceive of ourselves as Reformed Catholics, right? In other words, we conceive of ourselves as being squarely rooted in the middle of the great tradition of the church. We're not sectarians, as it were. We don't seek to separate from or distinguish ourselves from the thing that Christians have believed in all times and in all places. We very much want to engage our worship and receive our worship as a gift that has been given to us by the great tradition of the church. And that's what those first few sections are about. The next section, the calendar, I'm just going to keep going. So if anybody wants to stop, then just raise a hand. The next section, the calendar, gives us a sense of how the church thinks about time. I think I might have mentioned last week that there's any number of calendars that we use in our lives to organize our time. There's our work calendar, right? And there's our, there's the political cycle and the economic cycle, and there's the time that we mark within our own families. There's the family traditions and memories and histories that give us a sense of how the family moves through time, right? Time is something that is ubiquitous. We mark it in a variety of different ways, and the church has a particular way of marking time. And that's what the calendar is intended to give us. It's intended to take our experience of time and to orient it around Jesus Christ. The purpose of the calendar is to give the church kind of a structured way of walking with Jesus and recognizing that Jesus is walking with us as we walk through our days and as we walk through the seasons of our life. So the calendar is not incidental, right? The calendar is kind of intended to, it's almost a map, right? It's a map of our experience of time, such that if we ever find ourselves thinking, I don't know where I am right now. I don't know where I am in this season of my life. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know what's happening in the world. I don't know what's happening in my family. I don't know, You can come back to this and you can reorient yourself and restructure your sense of time by reconnecting to the church's witness to Jesus. You've got two primary pieces, if you will, to the calendar that organize all the rest of the calendar. You've got a fixed cycle and a movable cycle. The fixed cycle is Christmas. December 25th is always Christmas. That never varies. The movable cycle is Easter. Easter can move. The date that Easter falls varies from year to year depending on the lunar cycle. So where Easter is, moving target, and where Christmas is, always December 25th, you coordinate those two observances in any given calendar year, boom, and you've got the rest of the calendar. Everything else in the calendar follows from those two observances. Once you have marked Christmas and once you've marked Easter in any given year, you can calculate the rest of the calendar because those two are the ones that ground everything else. You have a number of observances that are listed that the church is invited to participate in over the course of the year. You have what are called principal feasts, major feasts, holy days, and days of special and optional observance. Now, what's the difference between those? The principal feasts, not surprisingly, are in some respects the most important. The principal feasts are the ones that provide the structure and the logic and the meaning for most of the other feasts. Those feasts, in other words, the church says, these are the big ones. If you're going to go, the C&E Christians, right, the Christmas and Easter Christians, they really should be CEEAPTA Christians. Right? If you're only going to go to church 7 times a year, you should go to those services, right? Those are the big ones. If you're touching those, okay, great. But you'll see that what all of those observances have to do with, in some way, shape, or form, have something to do with Jesus Christ and the church's experience of Jesus. Christmas, of course, incarnation, Epiphany, revelation to the Gentiles. Easter is resurrection. Ascension to the Father. The coming of the Spirit is just as much an observance that has to do with Jesus as it does with the Spirit, because when the Spirit comes, what does the Spirit bring with it? The presence of the risen Lord, right? Those two inform one another. The Trinity, as we move more fully into an understanding of an awareness of the presence of the risen Christ, we find ourselves thinking about God in a particular way. And that has ramifications for how we think about everything else. Hence the doctrine of the Trinity, hence that observance, and then all saints. The whole church recognizes that the whole church is the witness to all of these other events that we've talked about, Christmas, Epiphany, Easter, etc. So those observances, the principal feasts, follow immediately from Christmas and Easter. Then you've got a couple of other additional major feasts. The Feast of the Holy Name. Anybody know when that is? January 1, the Feast of the Holy Name. The Feast of the Presentation of Jesus in the Temple. The Feast of the Transfiguration. Now, the Transfiguration is always a little strange. The Transfiguration throws people because Transfiguration usually shows up twice in any given year. And it's kind of like, why do we do the Transfiguration twice? Well, technically speaking, we don't. We do Transfiguration once in August, but it usually shows up at another time in the year. Anybody have an idea as to when that might be? Think about the seasons of the church year. which season might be the one that would naturally afford us an opportunity to celebrate the Transfiguration? Which season has to do with revelation and disclosure? Epiphany, exactly, Epiphany. Epiphany is the season in which the revelation of the incarnate Word is celebrated. So we get the baptism of Jesus, and we get various miracle stories in which Jesus is revealed, right? And then usually, towards the very end of that season, we get an observance of the Transfiguration. Now that's not the second feast of the Transfiguration, it's part of the season of Epiphany. But what the calendar is telling us is that the Transfiguration has more than one lesson to teach us. So we get that.
Man,
Yeah, please.
Interrupt you, but
Yeah.
you may have said this, but what exactly is the holy name?
The Feast of the Holy Name?
What is that? What are we doing? Somebody named Jesus?
Yeah, basically, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It falls on January the 1st, so it's tied into the Christmas calendar, and it's tied, let me think about this a little bit. I'm going to go out on a little bit. I think I've got this nailed down, but I'm not entirely sure. It's connected to Jewish worship in as much as the 8th day after a child is born, especially a son, that's when the child would receive its name. So if Christmas is on the 25th, 8 days later would be the 1st, would be the time that the child gets named. So we I'm sorry, that happens at the presentation. That's the presentation in the temple. And those two get distinguished in our calendar. Presentation happens a little later. So that's what that is. Other thoughts, questions? Everyone okay? Now there's a total of 27 holy days. Feasts of all the apostles, so St. Thomas, Philip, Andrew, Paul, etc. Major feasts like that, major observances like that. Feast of Mary, Feast of John the Baptist. Those fall under the holy days. And then you get days of special and optional observance. Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, and Lent, all of which are fast days. Right? Yeah, please.
I don't understand why Ash Wednesday and Good Friday aren't more important.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. Why wouldn't those be part of a more robust? Why wouldn't those be included in the calendar as major feasts?
They're not feasts.
Well, yes and no. The reason for that is that once we begin the observance of the Triduum, what's called the Triduum, there's pretty much one service that goes all the way through that whole weekend. Like when we show up on Thursday for Maundy Thursday, we think, okay, well, here's the Maundy Thursday service. Then we go home and we come back the next day and it's Good Friday. So now they're doing the Good Friday service. And then you go home and you come back and it's Saturday. Now they're going to do the Holy Saturday service. In reality, that's all one service. All those observances are incorporated, liturgically speaking, into one ongoing observance. You start with the observance of Maundy Thursday, and that service is organically connected to and leads right into the observance of Good Friday. In other words, you really are kind of, you're not really living into the fullness of the worship of the church if you just come for Good Friday and have skipped Maundy Thursday, or if you just come for Maundy Thursday and, well, Good Friday is such a bummer, I'm just going to come back on Easter. No. Doesn't really work that way. Right? All of those are intended to be seen and experienced as part of one integral unit, which is why, for example, when the Good Friday service begins, how does the Good Friday service begin? Anybody remember? Does it begin with a procession? The ministers just enter and go, because all we're doing is reconvening from the previous night. It's basically like court is in recess, see you tomorrow. You come back, we are back in session. There's no beginning to the Good Friday service because the beginning happens the night before. So you just keep right on going. So Good Friday, I think, doesn't quite get its own feast in quite that way because it's integrated into the Triduum. The other reason that doesn't show up as a major feast is that within most of the church, the celebration of the death of Christ, or the observance of the death of Christ, happens the Sunday before. Right? Palm Sunday is called the Sunday of the Passion, Palm Sunday. Right? That's the full title of it. And you get this weird kind of shift in the middle of that service. The service begins with the Liturgy of the Palms and the remembrance of the triumphal entry, right? Glory, laud, and honor, Redeemer, King, great. And then all of a sudden there's this hard turn. There's this hard 90-degree turn, and we're hearing the Passion story. And there's this really kind of intentional juxtaposition between Jesus being lauded as king and then going to the cross on the same day. Right? That's intentional. And the reason that we end up calling Palm Sunday, Sunday of the Passion, Palm Sunday, is so that there is a Sunday in the church year when the death of Christ is observed. So we kind of hit Good Friday, if you will, twice, which is, I mean, that's an imprecise way of stating that. But my point is to say that the reason that Good Friday doesn't kind of show up on its own is because it shows up on both the Sunday of the Passion, Palm Sunday, and it shows up within the context of an integrated service, the Triduum, which are all organically part of the same observance. Does that help at all? Ooh, not sure. What?
No, well, but still, you leave out Ash Wednesday and Lent.
What do you, I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, it says days of special and optional observance.
Oh, yeah, but there are other days that are included in that list other than those. Ash Wednesday is considered a day of special observance. That's a special fast day. Right? Good Friday, special fast day. Things like that. The season of Lent, special fast. In other words, our observance is intended to be a bit more self-conscious during those periods. Right? You should be a little bit more dedicated, a little bit more disciplined, a little bit more aware of what you're doing during these observances, during these periods. Please.
If I go back a second, is there a list of the holy days?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, if you go to the calendar, I didn't list them there because there's so many, but if you were to look at the calendar, I forget what page it's on, but I can find it real quick here.
The calendar starts on page 19.
Holy Days is on page 16.
There you go. Yeah. If you go to 16, there they are. And then the other major feast at the top of page 17, there they all are. And you'll see there, all feasts of apostles. Well, that's more than one. All feasts of evangelists. Well, that's more than one. So there's a whole bunch there. But if you were to go through that, if you keep turning the pages, you'll see each month has a different page. And you'll see that some of the text, some of the observances are in bold print, and some of the observances are not in bold print. The ones that are in bold print fall under that holy days category. So I'm looking at May, for example. May the 1st, St. Philip and St. James, apostles, Feast of Apostles. Or, the previous April 25th, St. Mark the Evangelist, Feast of Evangelists.
What about the letters?
Let me talk about that in a little bit. Let's hold off on that, because that's actually kind of confusing. Please.
I just wanted to, I know that somewhere in the prayer book it says that every Friday is a fast of Good Friday in some sense, and every Sunday is a feast of the resurrection. So in a way, in Catholic countries, Sundays, when I grew up here in Dallas, everybody was supposed to stay home and read the Bible and go to church. In a Catholic country like France, or what was a Catholic country, I mean, people just break loose on Sunday after Mass. They do everything, that's a day to celebrate. But Friday, they're, Catholics fast and observe, and I guess think about the crucifixion.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's very much the idea. Yeah. I mean, you
got loose on Friday, and
yeah.
that's, hey, weekend's here.
Right. I mean, you see cultural vestiges of this still hanging around. I mean, when I was living in Wisconsin, everybody had a fish fry on Friday. Well, why does everybody have fish fries on Friday? Well, guess what? That grew out of the expectation that no one was going to be eating meat that day. So all the restaurants would, we'll do a fish fry. Okay, great. Nobody knows that. Now it's just who's got the best fish fry in town. Okay, let's keep moving forward. So the calendar, daily office. This is how to pray on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year basis. The daily office is the thing that is designed to give you an opportunity and a method, if you will, to live fully into the life of prayer. I don't know how to pray. I don't know when to pray. I don't have the words, or I don't have the time, or I don't whatever. Well, do this, and you will be faithful in prayer, right? Don't worry about it. Just do this. Here are the times. Here are the prayers. Say these things with intention, with awareness, with meaning, with purpose, and with conviction, and you will find yourself growing in prayer. Right? I mean, I think I mentioned last time that there's something very monastic about the prayer book. Just keep doing this. Just keep going. Right? Don't get overly fixated on, necessarily the technicalities of the liturgy, the right way to do it. Don't get overly fixated on your own emotional state. Don't get overly fixated on yourself at all. Just keep going. Keep praying. There's kind of a deep wisdom there for living the Christian life. Right? Don't allow yourself to get stuck with whatever preoccupation you may feel you have right now, whether it's something going on in your life or something going on in the world or whatever. Just keep going. And God will continue to meet you and will continue to form you and will continue to draw you closer. The office is one of the principal ways that we have available to us to do that. And what the office implicitly says is that you really can't grow in faith and in prayer and all the rest of it if all you're doing is just going to church once a week. I mean, you need this other stuff. You need to be in relationship with God every day, right, to grow in faith. So you've got morning prayer. You've got two versions of that. You've got noonday. You've got order of worship for the evening, which can be used a couple of different ways. Some flexibility in that service. You've got evening prayer. You've got compline. And then you've got even shorter versions of all of those daily devotions for individuals and families. So you've got a one-page version of morning prayer and a one-page version of noonday prayer and a one-page version of evening prayer and then close of day. So if you don't have time for morning prayer, if you don't have time to go through all the, whatever it is, 15 pages, 20 pages of morning prayer, you don't do the whole lot, everything in the office, but it's all there. If you don't have time for that, daily devotions, one page. Say these prayers, on with the day. Stop at noon, say these prayers, one page, on with the day. Evening prayer. I'm sorry, where is that? That is, I will take you. There you go. So you've got in the morning on page 137, you've got a psalm given to you, you've got a reading, you've got some suggestions there about the possibility of using the creed, you can offer your prayers, Lord's Prayer, collect, done. Right? Now, obviously, the goal is not to, I'm going to get through this as fast as I can, open my lips, O Lord, my mouth shall proclaim your praise, creed. Okay, on with my day. That's not the intent, right? Allow the prayers to pull you out of that sense of rush, that sense of hurry. Allow the prayers to draw you into a relationship with God, and you will find this becoming natural. You will find it becoming kind of important and significant and necessary. But these four observances, in the morning, at noon, in the evening, and then close of day, they draw their structure and their logic from the four principal offices: morning prayer, noonday prayer, evening prayer, and compline. You'll see that I've got a note there at the bottom having to do with the origin of the daily office. The services of the daily office draw on the traditional monastic offices. And I've listed those there and the times when they were traditionally observed. Usually the schedule there is a little flexible depending on the community and depending on all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's the office. The only other thing I might want to say at this point is that every time you do the office, there's some readings that you would do and there's some psalms that you would do. How do you know which psalms and which readings you're supposed to do? Well, that's the lectionary. So just turn over to the back side of the page quickly, and you'll see at the very bottom of that page, the daily office, 1 and 2. There's a 2-year cycle to reading through the lectionary for the daily office. Year 1, year 2. The Psalms are invariant. The Psalms pretty much stay the same all the time over year 1 and year 2. But the readings from the Old Testament, the readings from the New Testament, and the Gospel readings vary from day to day and from week to week and month to month, depending on whether you're in year 1 or whether you're in year 2. Year 1 in the daily office begins in even-numbered years, like 2022. The beginning of Advent, you start reading year 1 of the office. Well, why would you read an odd-numbered year in an even-numbered year? Well, what's the bulk of the calendar year going to be? It's going to be an odd year, 2023. So when Advent happens before an odd-numbered year, 2023, you do the odd-numbered office, lectionary, year 1. When Advent begins in a year prior to an even-numbered year, you do the even-numbered lectionary. That's the office. I mean, a lot more that we could say, obviously. And we can dig into it a little bit later in the series if we want to. But okay, moving on. The prayers of the church year. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Is there, like, in the prayer book, pages X to Y, which covers those daily readings and allows you to...
You mean, does it have the readings themselves? It lists the readings, but it doesn't actually have the text of the readings. Let's just go back to page 900 and, let's just say 940. Go all the way back to 940. Here we are in the daily office lectionary. This is it. This is the daily office lectionary. And year 1 is on the left-hand page, and year 2 is on the right-hand page. And what you've got there are 2 weeks of readings and psalms laid out for you. So in year 1, which is what we're in right now, here are your psalms and readings for year 1 in the daily office. You pretty much just ignore everything on the right-hand page when you're going through year 1. And then the following year, you come back and you're reading year 2, and you pretty much ignore everything that's on the left-hand page. So if it's December the 29th, and you're in year 1, and you want to know what psalm should I read for morning prayer, well, there it is right there. Psalm 18, 1 to 20. The first psalm that's listed right after the date is the psalm for morning prayer. And then there's that little, whatever that is, that little cross mark there. And then after that, what psalm should I read for the evening? Well, there it is. Psalm 18, 21 to 50. Oh, okay, so on December 29th, the psalm appointed for the day is Psalm 18. And I read the first 20 psalms in the morning, first 20 verses in the morning, and the last 30 verses in the evening. Great. Then I've got 3 readings. I've got an Old Testament reading, a New Testament reading, and a gospel reading. Now, here's what gets a little confusing. Don't worry about memorizing this. It's written down. Depending on how many readings you want to do, you may need to borrow from the other calendar. Let's say you just want to do 3 readings, right? So which 3 should I do? Well, in odd-numbered years, you do the first 2 readings, Old Testament and New Testament, in the morning, and then you do the gospel in the evening. In even-numbered years, don't worry about this, it's written down. In even-numbered years, you do the Old Testament and the gospel in the morning, and the New Testament in the evening. And if you want a second lesson in the evening, you borrow the Old Testament from the corresponding day and the other year. So you can always have 2 readings, and if you always have 2 readings, one of them is always from the Old Testament. And if you're borrowing from the other year, then let's just say we're going to do 4 readings on December the 29th. I want to do 4 readings that day. Okay, so it's year 1, so I know John's going to be in the evening. I'm going to do Isaiah and Revelation in the morning. And then in the evening, what's my Old Testament lesson going to be? It's going to be 2 Samuel. If you look across the page to year 2, 2 Samuel 23, there's my Old Testament reading for the evening office, and John 7. That's all written down. Don't worry about it. So the lectionary, in other words, I did all that as a way of making the point that the lectionary actually gives us a very rich and thorough grounding in the Scriptures every day. Right? You are always getting a healthy dose of Scripture if you do the office. Because if you do all the readings prescribed every day through the that's a good chunk of the Bible. So that's where it is. That's where it's located. Yeah. And all those instructions, everything that I just had to say about what lesson to read and all that, page 934. Concerning the daily office lectionary, here's how to use this instrument.
So if I wanted to read the scripture that's going to be read, that was read this morning, let's say.
Yeah.
I could have looked that up and read it.
That's the scripture that was read this morning in worship is a little different because that actually observes a different lectionary. There's 2 lectionaries. There's a Eucharistic lectionary, which is for weekly observance, weekly corporate worship. That's today's reading that you heard this morning. And there's the daily office lectionary. So today, this day, Sunday, on this particular day, has actually 2 lectionaries, 2 sets of readings. You can do the readings for the daily office. You can do morning prayer, noonday prayer, and evening prayer, daily office, and you can do a celebration of the Holy Eucharist. And you would use 2 completely different sets of readings. Yes, it is. It's immediately before the daily office lectionary. If you turn over to the back of the outline again, the very bottom, you see daily office. 1 line above that, you see Eucharistic lectionary. And there's 3 of those. There's year A, year B, and year C. And figuring those out is a little trickier because you've got to divide the sum of the numbers of a particular year to figure out what year you're in. So at any given year, you take the, this is fun. This is good stuff. This is job security. That's exactly what this is. So here's how this works. How do I know what year I'm in the Eucharistic Lectionary? Well, Advent 2022, right? We're currently in the church year that began in 2022. Oh, the timer. Look at the time. Take the numbers of 2022 and add them together. What do you get? 6. Divisible by 3? Yes, it is. If it's divisible by 3, it's year A. If it's not divisible by 3, you figure out the year closest that's divisible by 3 and then figure out where you are. So if you get a year that's not divisible by 3, then either the year before it was or the year 2 years after it is, and then you can figure out, I'm in A, I'm in B, I'm in C. Well, where does this come from? This comes out of the monastic tradition. This comes out of a tradition of a community of people who did this all the time. They thought about this very, very thoroughly. And they thought about this very, very carefully, and they organized this in as systematic a way as possible so that they could basically surrender themselves to it, right? The whole goal of this is so that you don't have to think about it. The only reason it sounds so complicated is because, somebody else kind of does this right now. But the whole goal of this is to give you a means of sitting down at any moment and just saying, all right, I'm too tired. I'm too tired to pray. I don't know how to pray. I don't know where I am in the year. What's going on? Would someone please tell me? Thank you. What do I do? Okay, that's great. And I say it, and I'm done, right? The church just kind of gives this to you. Here is a framework for ordering your life of prayer. Don't worry about it. We got it. We have ordered this in a way that we guarantee, we have ordered this in a way that will introduce you to the bulk of the scriptures and to the bulk of the observances of the church year if you just keep going. That's what this is about. We got a couple of questions, then we got to wrap up. So.
I probably should know this, but who were those people and when did they do this?
But most of them were monastics. Most of the impetus for this, especially in the daily office, came out of the monastic tradition. The Benedictines, especially, were probably. Sorry.
Are they French? French people, Benedictines?
Well, they started in Italy, and then they spread north. When Europe was kind of falling apart in the 5th century, many of them were up in the British Isles. So we as Anglicans have a particular debt to them. And then they came back down south, re-evangelized the continent, and then other monastic traditions grew out of that one. That's a whole story in and of itself, but that's the tradition out of which this comes.
Isn't the little devotional that you're signed up for that you get every morning from the church, that has the readings at the bottom?
Yeah, if you get the podcasts from St. Michael, that's what it draws on.
It's a little, I get it as an email, and it's
Yeah.
a short prayer, and then at the bottom it has the readings.
Yeah, but if you're listening to our podcasts, we write our podcasts, we deliver our podcasts based on the readings that are prescribed for the daily office.
Is anything significant left out? You said it covers most.
Yeah, it depends who you ask. I mean, I mentioned last week that there can be controversy about the lectionary. That would be a much wider conversation. So, but yes.
You're a doctor, so did you study all this a lot more than all these regular priests?
This is not my area of expertise, believe me. there are
Sounds like it is.
there are people who know this much better than I do.
I don't believe that.
Yeah, hear me now and believe me later. No, this is, I think the thing that really kind of inspires me about this is what I was just talking about a few minutes ago. It's the extent to which, when you grasp what this is, when you grasp that what this is intended to be is the church's gift to you to a life of prayer, then it becomes very attractive, right? When it becomes something else, when it becomes ritualism, when it becomes this thing you have to do, when it becomes an invitation to meet God in daily life, and when it becomes an invitation to witness to the presence of the risen Christ with the community on a weekly basis, then it kind of is exciting, right? Well, how do we do that? And why is it, what is this intended, how is it intended to set that up for me? If you can receive it in that spirit, then getting into the nuts and bolts of it is a lot of fun. But if you just think of it as this, weird thing that these monks did back in, the 4th century, well, what is that? Well, then you got to be a little weird to get into it.
Right? Numbers of unwashed masses in this building that don't know any of this stuff. Even cradle Episcopalians,
Yeah.
have never been presented with this information. To
Yeah.
use it like as a gateway tool
Yeah.
to daily spiritual life.
Yeah,
It's just a
that's
tool.
what it is. This is how we do it. This is how we do it.
When Cranmer did this prayer book, he thought he was simplifying the Roman Catholic
Yeah.
rituals, and
Right.
I appreciate him doing that, but I sure hate to think what they were like before. This is great.
Well, yeah, I mean, I mentioned briefly last week, right, exactly right. Last week I mentioned that, back in the day, you literally had to go to church with a stack of books. If you were the celebrant, you were walking into church like this, and I'm going to put this over here, I'm going to put this over here, I'm going to put this over here. Cranmer and Luther and others. I mean, Cranmer's not the only one, but I mean, one of the things that many of the magisterial Protestant reformers did is just say, we're done with that. Okay, we've got to go. I'm really sorry, we've got to go. I've got to preach at the 11 o'clock service, so I need to be on my way. We'll pick up where we left off, right? We won't.